Good evening. My name is Richard Curtis, and I'll be your host this evening for Hemispheres. This evening we're going to explore issues related to nuclear weapons, disarmament issues, waste issues, and also a reunion that the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center is involved with that we'll be telling you about a little bit later. We have with us in the studio Tom Marshall from the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. Let's make sure he's plugged in.
Hello, Richard. Thank you.
Welcome. And joining us on the phones, we have Byron Plumley from the American Friends Service Committee in Denver. Byron, you there?
Yes. Thanks, Richard.
And also joining us from California, we have Mary Leah Kelly. Mary Leah, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good evening.
And I'm going to have to ask you to speak up a little bit to keep your volume up for me.
Okay.
Okay. And Mary Leah, you're with the Tri-Valley Cares. Could you tell us a little bit about Tri-Valley Cares?
Well, the acronym stands for Citizens Against a Radioactive Environment, and we're a grassroots group based here in Livermore, California, in the shadows of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is an active Defense Program's nuclear weapon design lab. And we work on peace, social justice, and environmental issues with the belief that these three issues are inextricably linked at their root, and one place where they come together is with respect to nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons policy issues.
And Byron, you are a disarmament specialist with the American Friends Service Committee, is that correct?
Yes, I work on a variety of disarmament issues, and the American Friends Service Committee has a long history of working to end the nuclear arms race, particularly here in the Denver area. We have a 25-year history of working to close Rocky Flats as a nuclear weapons plant. So,
and I understand that you're going to be delivering a talk on this subject tomorrow evening.
yes, I have the opportunity, thanks to Tom Marshall and the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, to do a presentation tomorrow evening at 7:30 at the center.
And what's the address, Tom?
1520 Euclid Avenue in Boulder. It's up on the hill.
There charge for that? Is it a fundraiser or anything?
It's a free discussion.
Okay.
It's open to everyone.
Donations gratefully accepted, however.
And to get things rolling, I want to just read a little blurb from some background material that the people at Peace Action Education Fund put together, an outfit out of Washington, D.C. It says, in September 1996, President Clinton signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the preamble of which calls for, quote, the cessation of all nuclear weapons test explosions and all other nuclear explosions by constraining the development and qualitative improvement of nuclear weapons and ending the development of advanced new types of nuclear weapons, unquote. While the United States has not conducted a traditional nuclear test since 1992, the Department of Energy has created and expanded a so-called stockpile stewardship program to ensure the safety and reliability, their words, of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Yet, the computer simulations, quote, subcritical, unquote, nuclear tests, which means those that don't involve a complete chain reaction, and elaborate new laboratory facilities that are part of the stockpile stewardship program contribute to the design of new nuclear weapons. A previously secret DOA document, the Green Book, cites DOE's plans for new or modified nuclear weapons designs. Stockpile stewardship, thus serves to sustain the nuclear weapons complex under the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Now, Byron, I don't know about you, but that sounds to me like a blazing contradiction there. What are they up to?
I think what the problem we have is that the United States is not committed to nuclear disarmament. From the very beginning, from 1946, with the very first United Nations General Assembly resolution, there was a call to eliminate atomic weapons. 30 years ago, there was a non-proliferation treaty, Article 6, which specifically calls for halting the nuclear arms race and working for nuclear disarmament. And so what we see now in this comprehensive test ban treaty, which many of us would like to believe is finally a step toward nuclear disarmament, in a lot of ways is simply a smokescreen to continue the development of nuclear weapons. And that new name for the nuclear weapons development is stockpile stewardship.
And Mary Leah, you probably are in the heart of all of this, being close to one of the big laboratories that would be involved in these kinds of projects. What are people talking about with the issues here?
Well, essentially, stockpile stewardship is an end run, a technological end run around the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. My organization and American Friends Service Committee and Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center and thousands of organizations around the world have worked years and decades for the Test Ban Treaty. The vision was not only to cut off the nuclear weapons test explosions, but also to stop the sort of forever increasing sophistication of nuclear weapons. And what stockpile stewardship is an attempt, by the way, using $60 billion, that's billion with a B, of our tax dollars over the next 13 years, to do an end run and continue tweaking and modernizing and upgrading and any other name they give it, nuclear weapons systems. How they're planning to do this is through a sort of brave new nuclear weapons complex that would be based not only at the Nevada test site, but at the laboratories here in Livermore and at Los Alamos and Sandia in New Mexico. Lawrence Livermore is currently building what will be the single largest and most expensive of these so-called stockpile stewardship facilities, called the National Ignition Facility. Now, the first time I heard that, I thought maybe it was part of the Clean Car Initiative, ignition. But in fact, the kind of ignition that they're talking about is thermonuclear ignition. So that's the first thing to kind of conceptualize. What they're building is a series of facilities, each one to conduct a nuclear weapons experiment on a different aspect of the nuclear weapons explosion. So these are actual physical tests. Then they plan to take supercomputers and put the information together with the archive data from past nuclear tests to upgrade the nuclear weapons codes, and that's the software that's at the heart of nuclear weapons development, and continue to modernize, quote-unquote, nuclear weapons.
Now, the codes that you're referring to that's computer codes that are determining how various pieces of the bomb come together and interact with each other?
Correct. What the different parameters are, and if you tweak A, what will that do to B?
Okay. What kind of activity is happening around there, around the lab, in your community? Are people concerned about this, or are people kind of happy to have the money flow in their way, or what's the word on the street?
The National Ignition Facility, like all of the other stockpile stewardship so-called facilities, is quite controversial. The laboratory sees it as the salvation of the laboratory as a nuclear weapons lab. They do not want to convert into a civilian science sort of green laboratory, although frankly many of their employees would like to see conversion happen. In the community, there's a great deal of concern because, of course, these are thermonuclear explosions inside the reactor vessel. The fuel is a 50-50 mixture of deuterium and radioactive tritium. This is a community that has already suffered a great deal of radioactive and toxic pollution from past activities at the lab, and this facility will incrementally add to the radioactive and toxic pollution in the community. From a taxpayer point of view, the facility is going to cost $1.2 billion to build, and that's the estimate, and that estimate keeps going up. And its life cycle cost is $4.7 billion. And that $4.7 billion doesn't include the cost of managing the radioactive and toxic waste, nor does it include the cost of decommissioning and decontaminating the facility. So it's a tremendous black hole, as is the whole program, budget-wise. Further, as peace activists, we're concerned about its proliferation aspects. For example, research on the National Ignition Facility and data from that research can aid a country that has a solid technological base in getting more quickly to a sophisticated nuclear weapon like a boosted fission or thermonuclear weapon.
Well, I wonder if, why don't we back up a little bit? Byron, could you tell us a little bit about the history of this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty?
Well, just briefly, what we might say is that this has been in the works for at least 30 years, since the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968. There have been efforts to work diligently to stop the development of nuclear weapons and to stop the testing of nuclear weapons. There was, in fact, in 1963, even prior to that, the Partial Test Ban Treaty. And the Partial Test Ban Treaty, in a way, is a model for us at this time. We can look at that and say, well, how did the United States respond to the elimination of atmospheric testing? Because that was kind of the first step, was to stop testing in the atmosphere. Well, their response was to conduct an aggressive underground nuclear test program. So in 1963, when we got the Partial Test Ban Treaty, essentially what we got was the development of underground testing. And it's very interesting then to see that there is a comparison, actually a point-by-point comparison, with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that we are trying to ratify at this time and what happened with the Partial Test Ban. At this point, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has been presented as a deal. In other words, President Clinton, in his grand effort to sign the Test Ban Treaty, made significant promises to the weapons manufacturers, and particularly the nuclear weapons labs, that we would be able to continue a broad range of experimental programs and things that would help us develop our nuclear technology. So we find ourselves, I think, at this point, really asking questions about the integrity of the Test Ban Treaty. And in fact, if we sign the Test Ban Treaty, have we locked in a commitment to $60 billion worth of new nuclear weapons research and development?
What's happening in other parts of the world with other countries in the treaty?
Well, who wants to pick that up?
Well, many nations are complaining strenuously. The one, of course, that's been in the media is India, which says that it will not sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty unless and until the nuclear powers agree to a timetable for disarmament, because otherwise, in India's view, it will simply lock in a nuclear apartheid where countries like the United States, with the technological base and the archive data from past nuclear tests, can institute a stockpile stewardship program and move forward with its nuclear weapons research. And a country like India, which doesn't have an archived database of past nuclear tests, would need nuclear testing in order to develop a more sophisticated arsenal. So clearly the disarmament issue and the intent of the treaty is quite divisive, and Pakistan, of course, won't sign and ratify unless India does. But beyond those countries, I myself have been at the United Nations and have heard the ambassador from Mexico complain vigorously about the United States stockpile stewardship program. I've heard Malaysia give speeches in the UN First Committee on the dangers of stockpile stewardship, and have talked to a number of countries who have registered extreme concern, and it's a matter of sort of political leverage. So it's clear that while the Clinton administration made a deal with the laboratories to try to buy them off in terms of domestic ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, that the United States Stockpile Stewardship Program is an impediment to global acceptance and global ratification of the treaty. And as some of your listeners probably know, in order for the treaty to fully enter into force, the 44 named countries who have nuclear reactors and are therefore nuclear capable must sign. And a number of them have indicated that they cannot or will not sign and ratify if the United States Stockpile Stewardship Program goes forward. So I think we're at a very important juncture, and I'd like to hearken back to something that Byron talked about. I think we should take a lesson from what happened in 1963. When nuclear testing went underground, a lot of activists kind of went home as if it were all over. And of course now with hindsight we know that it wasn't, that nuclear development continued underground. Now of course we're stopping underground testing, and there's the issue of nuclear weapons development continuing in the laboratories. And I think as activists we have to maintain a vigilance and maintain a voice and say comprehensive test ban treaty, absolutely yes. We've worked for it for decades. It's the aspiration of millions of people around the world. But we have to also preserve the vision that's in that treaty, which is to choke off the development of ever more sophisticated nuclear weapons and support genuine disarmament. So I think our work is cut out for us here.
You know, Mary Leah, if I could just add to what you're saying, this past October, John Deutsch had a panel at MIT, and in that panel, he made it very clear that nuclear weapons were still a very important part of U.S. power in the world. But he added that the United States never intended to implement Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was just one of those things. He said it's just one of those things where you say yes at a conference in order to get what you want out of the conference. You know, and I think that the truth of that is glaring in terms of U.S. policy the last 30 years. And then in December, or well, in probably November, President Clinton issued his directive that the United States would be willing to use nuclear weapons against any kind of chemical or biological weapon threat. You know, and so I think that the whole world sees very clearly that we are deeply committed to the use and the development of nuclear weapons.
But Byron, we should probably point out that Deutsch is the Director of Central Intelligence, and the Article 6 you're referring to would be what?
Well, Article 6 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty from 1968 is that kind of that pivotal statement that, if I could just quote this sentence, each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control.
So the subtext is he's just saying that disarmament is a non-issue. It's not something we're going to do.
Right. We never intended to, and we're certainly not going to do it now.
When I joined the peace movement in 1983, I had come to the conclusion that I was for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And I remember thinking that, maybe I'm a little bit radical. And then after several years in the peace movement, I realized that the elimination of nuclear weapons is U.S. law as well as international law, because we signed and ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So actually, that's the law.
There's also another quote I'd like to read here that's kind of telling. It's from testimony by Siegfried Hecker, who is director of Los Alamos National Laboratory.
Yes, retired.
Okay, this was from March 1997, a subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee of the U.S. Senate, and he said, quote, "Our job is to help the U.S. government to ensure that no one in the world doubts that the United States has the capability to project overwhelming force in the defense of its vital interests." And I guess Secretary Deutsch is just telling us the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, Sid Hecker's testimony, in an odd way, points out the vulnerability of this program. If folks are at home thinking, well, what can I do? I'd like to point out that Sig Hecker was testifying for the program before Congress. Its vulnerable point is the budget. Requires $4.5 billion plus a year. And if folks want to weigh in to support the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and stop ongoing nuclear weapons programs, one way to do it is to register an opinion with representatives and other decision makers saying, cut the budget.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I could add to that, too. Tom with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center and many other activist groups here in Colorado, as well as around the country, are mounting a campaign to call on the Senate to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and stop funding stockpile stewardship. We believe both of those have to be dealt with at the same time. And what we're asking for is that we use only limited funds that are necessary to maintain a passive guardianship for the nuclear weapons until they can be completely abolished.
Now we should probably be clear on that point, because isn't that actually the claim that's put forward by the Department of Energy, that that's the purpose of the stockpile stewardship program?
Well, yes, and I think the point is there already is a guardianship program.
Right, I mean, but they don't say that their purpose is to develop new and better weapons.
Well,
or do they admit that?
It's in the small print. In fact, this is a debate that George Orwell would have loved were he still alive. The Department of Energy talks about, quote, the safety and, quote, the reliability of nuclear weapons, yet their proposal is to upgrade these nuclear weapons codes so that they'll be three-dimensional and more sophisticated. And there's a tremendous amount of technical and scientific opinion, both within the department and outside of the department, e.g. in academia, that says that that's not the approach at all. That the best approach to maintaining the existing nuclear weapons is through this guardianship or curatorship approach, where you use the Department of Energy's existing surveillance and evaluation program. You do some limited remanufacturing of parts, if a wire gets rusty, but all you do is maintain it passively until it awaits dismantlement. Now, there's an absolute disarmament, perhaps, proposal that says you don't even do that, that you just focus on disarmament, and I think that's a valid point. Our organization would say it's okay to maintain them as they await dismantlement, but the emphasis has to be on dismantlement. And what the department is trying to do is something completely different.
And what do they say about the level of readiness that they have to maintain to use these weapons?
Go ahead, Mary Lou.
Well, the actual reliability number is classified, but it is known that the United States, because it has a policy of potential first use of nuclear weapons, demands a reliability that is within 10% of the design yield and other performance characteristics. For example, if you have, off the top of my head, a 7 megaton nuclear weapon, and we drop it on somebody, and it goes off with 6 megatons of force, we've just killed all those people with an unreliable nuclear weapon. So reliability isn't just that the weapon will detonate, it's that it will detonate with all of the performance characteristics, including the yield, that the designer certified.
Go ahead, Byron.
And we maintain our nuclear weapons on alert, even in this post-Cold War period. Here in Colorado, we have 49 Minuteman III missiles, and as well as a number of MX missiles, which still carry nuclear warheads on alert, even though they're targeted in the ocean. So as far as our plan, we're still very much...
Livermore, by the way, is upgrading the warhead for the MX missile under the Stockpile Stewardship Program.
Wait, what does that mean? That they would develop a better one and switch it out?
Exactly. Right now, inside the design labs, there's a replacement program going on designing a new warhead for the current Trident submarine-launched weapons. They're developing a new missile itself for the Trident, plus actually DoD wants development of a new submarine. They're also upgrading the warhead to the MX. They're working on strategic bombs. The B-61, which they just developed the Earth penetrator version, the B-6111. Now they're making that into a glide bomb so that it can be used on the B-2 and make up for its stealth inadequacies.
Well, and it's interesting, too, in a December 1st article, the B-6111 is going to be tested up in Fairbanks at the Army's Yukon range.
Right, they do drop testing.
Yeah.
And there's also some black budget programs like a high-powered radio frequency warhead, which both Livermore and Los Alamos have worked on. And Livermore's actually working on a low-yield nuclear weapon that would supposedly go up and intercept incoming non-nuclear weapons like chemical or biological weapons, which I call it the nuclear troops weapon because we saw what happened in the Gulf War. So there's this whole robust nuclear weapons design program going on in the laboratories under the guise of stockpile stewardship, and that's the bottom line.
Well, and it would appear that we've reached that halfway point at which I promised to let the two of you go. So I'll say thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Richard, for the opportunity, and hopefully people can come tomorrow night to the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, and we can talk a little more about the Colorado part of this campaign.
I'd I'd like to thank you as well. I had the pleasure of working with Byron and Tom in Denver recently, and I wish you a good event tomorrow night.
Well, thank you both very much. We're going to take a brief musical interlude, and we'll be back with Kathy Partridge and Tom Marshall to discuss related issues, in particular, what to do with the waste. Once again, this is Hemispheres. So my name's Richard Curtis. I'm your host this evening, and we're talking about nuclear issues. Joining us still in the studio with us is Tom Marshall, although he's been very quiet, and we've traded phone guests for a lone guest, Kathy Partridge, who we're sure can pick up the slack of two phone guests all by herself. Are you there with us?
Yes. Hello.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard, for having us. Hi, Tom.
Hello, Kathy.
And Tom, why is it that you think it's important for us to be talking about these issues today?
Well, I think that right now we're at a crossroads regarding nuclear issues, both from a disarmament perspective and from a cleanup and waste perspective. We can choose right now to take a disarmament path that would leave us with a safer world. We can choose to clean up the mess that resulted from approximately a half century of weapons production and leave ourselves with a safer world in that respect, or we can continue down the same path, producing more nuclear weapons, producing more nuclear waste, and not dealing with the problems responsibly. I think it's Kathy's on the line to talk for the most part about a reunion that is coming up, commemorating 20 years of protests at Rocky Flats, and I think it's an appropriate time for this reunion. The 1978 protest was termed at the nuclear crossroads. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, but we're at those crossroads again. And for years, people around Rocky Flats worked to stop weapons production by shutting down Rocky Flats, and they didn't do that simply to see the weapons production move elsewhere. And as we heard in the previous segment, that's exactly what's happening. We have continued weapons production, and it is happening under this guise of something called stockpile stewardship, but it keeps us on the same road. And so I thought we might ask Kathy to talk a little bit about the history of those protests and how that relates to the current weapons development efforts.
Sure, Tom. I'd be happy to, and I certainly agree that we are absolutely at a nuclear crossroads again, and quite definitely the point and purpose of the Rocky Flats movement was not to simply have the production moved somewhere else. You know, the fact that Rocky Flats is in our backyard is certainly a huge consideration, and a lot of people always were concerned about the environmental consequences for the Colorado Front Range. But first and foremost, the concern was nuclear proliferation and the risk of nuclear war. And I think perhaps the somewhat more subdued work that's continuing around Rocky Flats, the fact that it's not quite as hot in terms of involvement as it has been at times in the past, it's because I think a lot of people are not aware of what your guests earlier pointed out, which is that the production and stockpilings of weapons is continuing. It's just hidden away a little more effectively. I might start by saying about my first involvement with Rocky Flats, because it was about 20 years ago. A couple years before that, I guess, I participated for the first time in smaller actions that were called primarily by the American Friends Service Committee. But in 1978, actually starting the year before, the American Friends Service Committee down in Denver and the Boulder Mobilization for Survival, which was a grassroots, unincorporated citizens organization, worked very hard to organize and set up what we hoped was going to be a large demonstration. And what it turned out to be was an enormously large demonstration, which spawned the Rocky Flats Truth Force, a civil disobedience direct action organization, which essentially occupied the railroad leading into the tracks for over a year. I believe it was an entire And then following that was a series of other large actions, including the largest, which was the near encirclement of Rocky Flats, which was, I believe, Tom, was it 18,000 people? Do you recall the number?
Not exactly. It was
Yeah.
approximately that, around 20,000.
I think we'll run with 18,000 people. There's certainly people who could correct me as to the exact number. And then also a civil disobedience blockade that occurred a few years later. All of these were part of a movement that we'd like to not just commemorate because it was cool, and we had a lot of fun being involved, and it meant a lot in our personal lives and in our own life paths, but also because we feel it involves significant work that did affect the progress of the Cold War, the thawing of the Cold War, and what appeared, especially at that time, towards the end of that work, as Rocky Flats was closed, to be a very successful effort to affect national and even international policy.
Kathy, when was that big encirclement?
See, the encirclement would have been about
1983.
1983.
Do you remember the day?
Not exactly, no. I mean, I remember the day. I don't remember the date. But I was certainly out there, and it was quite a phenomenal thing to be a part of. We stood hand in hand, and some places were several people deep. Others, like where I was, we were stretching out and fingers touching, nearly completely encircling the plant.
And when is it that the big reunion is planned?
We're planning that for April the 24th through the 26th, which coincides with not the encirclement, but it's closest to the dates 20 years ago of what we called at that point the Nuclear Crossroads demonstration, and that was our logo on our posters and so forth, at least the initial posters, because I want to emphasize that this was a movement, and not everything was planned by single organizations. Stuff was happening because people cared in a very broad way. And by the time that demonstration happened, there were probably, a dozen active affinity groups in Boulder, ranging from one that had a socialist orientation. And I know my neighbor, Susie, still has her T-shirt that they made to identify themselves as the Socialist Affinity Group, to an affinity group that decided their connecting purpose was to fly kites at Rocky Flats. And these various organizations, there was spontaneous support for the work from, like for instance, Naropa Institute organized a poetry reading to benefit the organizing against Rocky Flats. That was actually the first of really a historical support on the parts of particularly the poets, Allen Ginsberg, of course, Anne Waldman, in supporting the work of the citizen activists. And what it felt like every day, something new was happening as people came together to try to make their statement and their involvement around Rocky Flats. The meetings got bigger and bigger. Work just seemed to get done. Early on it was quite a burden to make the phone calls and so forth, and as that particular action got closer, there were many, many people wanting to share in the effort. It was a very exciting time, and that's why I think we call it a movement rather than a campaign, because in many ways it had a life of its own.
And what do you all have planned for April 24 to 26?
Well, let's see, Tom. We have a lot planned. Of course, there'll be a real focus on sharing of memories and sort of oral history. We'll put some time into that. We're expecting people from around the country that participated in the various waves of the Rocky Flats movement to come and want to be doing some actual reunion types of activities. So there'll be a potluck. We're planning a poetry reading. We're hoping to have a large sort of public concert, and with musical guests and speakers and so forth that we hope will attract a lot of community people. We figure there's certainly thousands of people in the area still who at one point or another participated in this work, and so we're hoping, they'll touch in. We're planning a participatory arts project, a youth camp of activities for children and young people, informational workshops on campus as well as at the Peace Center, and of course an action at Rocky Flats on Sunday of the reunion weekend to actually point out that there still is a lot of important work that needs to be done.
Are you going to circle it?
Are we going to circle it? Well, again, this is a movement. The folks of us that are planning are sort of open to people's possibilities. I think at this point it sounds like the plan is to have a march from Boulder to Rocky Flats, and then have more of a gathering together. Tom, can you add to that?
The plans for what happens at Rocky Flats are developing, but I think you're right. We're open to just about anything, and whatever people's energy wants to creates, we will certainly be open to.
It would be poetic.
That's right.
To encircle the plant again.
That's right.
Well, before the time gets too far away from us, we wanted to talk a little bit about the continuing issues at Rocky Flats, which are, part of the motivation, obviously. And I think what we ought to start with is the big buzzword of the day, which is vitrification.
And before you do, I'm going to allow Tom to very capably to answer these questions and say goodbye and listen as you all keep talking. So thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, Kathy. I just to tie this into the reunion, one of the hopes for this reunion is that we can bring people who were involved in the past back into these very real issues that we are still facing regarding nuclear issues, regarding disarmament, regarding cleanup at Rocky Flats. And we spent a little bit of time earlier this evening talking about the disarmament issues, the fact that we still are facing this weapons buildup, this weapons development program, and that we need to work to stop that. The flip side of weapons development is what we're facing out at Rocky Flats right now, and that is contamination, radioactive waste, and leftover plutonium that we don't know what to do with.
Well, and that's where I wanted to explore some of the terms that people might be familiar with from the other news that they hear on the station. To explain a little bit about what it means to vitrify plutonium.
Vitrify plutonium means to put it into a glass form. We have about 14 tons of plutonium left over at Rocky Flats. It's classified as surplus to national security needs. They don't intend to use it any longer for weapons development, but it's a very toxic substance. It's not a good thing to have just lying around. It could possibly be reused by a subnational or terrorist group for a nuclear weapon or a radioactive dispersal bomb. So what do we do with this stuff?
Well, it exists now. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned plutonium oxide.
That's right. The plutonium's in a variety of forms. Some of it is in a metal, some of it's in a pit form, which is what the primary product was, a pit or a trigger, a nuclear weapons trigger. That was the primary product out at Rocky Flats.
Which would be metallic.
That would be metallic.
In nature. Okay.
A lot of it is in the form of an oxide. It's one step away from the weapons-grade plutonium, and that's a very fine powder, almost like a charcoal, a burnt charcoal, if you could imagine that.
So this 14 tons of plutonium is lying around in a metal form and also in this powder form.
In a variety of forms. A lot of it in that powdered oxide form. That's correct.
Okay, so we want to try and do something with that.
Right. The question is, what do we do with it? And there are essentially there are two competing plans. One is to take plutonium from Rocky Flats and elsewhere and run it through civilian reactors. The result would be a spent fuel.
How long would that take to use up 14 tons of plutonium?
It would take a good amount of time. I don't have an exact figure, but you mix a small amount of plutonium with uranium.
So
It's not
decades,
it would
perhaps.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And there are consortiums of companies bidding to do that work right now, and that seems to be the favored plan for dealing with most of the surplus plutonium in the U.S. right now. The other plan is to immobilize it, either in a glass form or in a ceramic form. You put it in a very large 2-ton glass or ceramic log. It would be difficult to steal. You could poison it with certain different items such as alpha emitters, depleted uranium, rare earths, that sort of thing, that would add to the processing that would be required in order to recover the plutonium for reuse. To us, that seems to be a far more responsible approach to dealing with the surplus plutonium as opposed to running it through reactors.
And what's involved in that process? Is that something that can happen fairly quickly, or is that also something that would take years and years to accomplish?
The vitrification
Yeah.
you're referring to. It is everything that we have seen indicates that it would be quicker to start vitrification up rather than going the mixed oxide route or running it through reactors. And we at the Peace and Justice Center have suggested that we should seriously explore, the Department of Energy should seriously explore the idea of building a small-scale pilot vitrification facility at Rocky Flats so that we could quickly put this stuff into a glass form. That would have a number of benefits. First of all, it would put it in a safer form for storage, far safer than having this loose powdery oxide sitting there in cans. So it's safer for storage. It would also be better in a better form if we did decide to transport that material somewhere else, and it would make it easier and more politically acceptable to have that material transported through a variety of states to another destination.
How vulnerable is the plutonium sitting there? I mean, presumably it's protected against theft, but what about something more dramatic, earthquake or tornado?
There are concerns about the primary storage building, Building 371. That's going through upgrades to make it more seismically stable. However, Building 371 has only the roof as a barrier, as the upper barrier for 3 of the vaults in which plutonium will be stored. We have advocated that there be a new plutonium storage vault built at Rocky Flats so that it's safer. If this material were put into a vitrified form, it would certainly be safer for storage at Rocky Flats. We've also, I think most of us, heard that there are very real concerns regarding the security at Rocky Flats. Current and former members of the security force have come out and said that the security is not up to par out there. And we do have approximately 1 ton of plutonium missing from Rocky Flats. According to official records, they are a ton short.
How does one lose a ton of anything, let alone plutonium?
We'd have to ask the Department of Energy for that.
And they don't have an answer?
No.
No.
They cannot explain where that has gone. There is over a ton of plutonium missing from Hanford. In all, we've misplaced somewhere around 2 tons of plutonium in the U.S. So I think that points to the need for putting this stuff in a form such that it is difficult for diversion.
Diversion would mean someone stealing it and using it to make bombs.
That's right.
Okay. It's kind of a nice euphemism.
That's right.
Diversion. It's like sunshine units.
The other thing I did want to point out is that one of our primary concerns with this plutonium being used in reactors is that it's likely to fuel a plutonium economy around the world, where we have Russia and other nations taking plutonium and running it through reactors, taking the spent fuel, reprocessing it, pulling the plutonium out, running it back through reactors. So we have plutonium constantly in use around the world, and it defeats the very purpose that we initially set up this plutonium mixed oxide fuel program for, which is to take the plutonium out of circulation. Instead, we have more and more plutonium in circulation around the world.
In ordinary use, do these reactors use plutonium?
No,
Okay, so that would be a special thing in and of itself.
they would be brand new. That's correct.
Okay. How expensive and complicated is the vitrification process?
It's unclear exactly how expensive it would be. However, there have been estimates for a small-scale pilot vitrification facility at around $1 million, which is a significant amount of money, but in Department of Energy terms is not a lot. We're spending approximately $500 million at Rocky Flats every year. The cleanup program for the Department of Energy runs at about $5 billion annually.
Who makes the decisions about what's going to be done? Someone must be in charge of all this.
In terms of what we do with plutonium,
Yeah, I mean, is it ultimately the Secretary of Energy?
the Department of Energy and the Secretary of Energy have an awful lot of influence, and that is where most of the decisions are being made about what we do with the plutonium right now.
Is it worthwhile for people to get a hold of their congressional representatives, senators, and...
I think it certainly is, and I think the message that they need to hear is that we are concerned about the worldwide proliferation of plutonium, and that plutonium should be treated as a waste, not a resource. We should be taking it out of circulation, not putting it into circulation, and that we should be exploring immobilizing this material as a waste.
Okay, and I know that one of the issues around all of this is the pace at which it happens and the standards that are set for determining when the site is clean.
Right. What happens with the plutonium is a very important piece of cleanup at Rocky Flats, and we hear the term cleanup bandied about in the news quite a bit these days. The plutonium portion of that is a very significant piece of it. But also included in cleanup is what happens with the soils out there, what happens with the contaminated buildings out there, what happens with the groundwater out there, what happens with the tons of radioactive waste that are sitting out there. All of that is part of cleanup. And I think that one significant piece of this to explore is the cleanup standards that are being set. There's a very real question. Does the U.S. government plan to clean up Rocky Flats in a credible manner? And unfortunately, the messages that we seem to be getting right now are no. There's something that has been developed is their cleanup plan was called the 10-year plan until about a year ago, and they decided that sounded not. I guess they felt it sounded too Soviet. And they changed it to the 2006 plan. Essentially, they have a 10-year plan nationally. The Rocky Flats 10-year plan ends up being about a 13-year plan. DOE headquarters says you will clean up in 10 years. Rocky Flats says, well, we can't do that. We're cleaning up in 13, and they can't seem to agree on that. In any event, there's a real concern about whether we are having a time and cost-driven cleanup or a cleanup that is driven by needs and safety issues out there. And as I said, an important piece of that are the cleanup standards that are being set for the soils. The Department of Energy and the State of Colorado and the Environmental Protection Agency have all agreed that they can leave 652 picocuries of plutonium in the soil out there in the buffer area and 562 picocuries in the industrial area. That compares to a cleanup in the Marshall Islands for plutonium of 40 picocuries per gram, and the government determined that at 40 picocuries per gram of soil that was not safe enough for people to move back to that area. So it seems that we are certainly getting the short end of the stick here.
You said 652 picocuries compared to 40.
That's correct. And the average background levels for this area are 0.04 picocuries per gram. So we're talking about a significant amount of plutonium that is being allowed into to be left in the soils here.
Yeah, that little statistic alone is incredibly disturbing. If 40 isn't safe, who in their right mind is arguing that 652 could possibly be safe?
Well, essentially what the government would argue is that they are putting restrictions in place that won't allow people to simply go there and build a house, that there will be fences, that there will be use restrictions that don't allow for that to happen. Unfortunately, what we are talking about is a material that is going to be dangerous for 240,000 years. That's how long plutonium remains dangerous. And so the idea that fences will stay up for 240,000 years, or that various deed restrictions will be in force for that amount of time, is absolutely ludicrous. And what we need to be planning for is a cleanup that is really protective of future generations who may not be aware of what happened here.
What about leaching through the soil with groundwater or just dust?
Well, both of those are a very real concern. We've all driven down Route 36, and seen the dust that's being kicked up from the construction that's happening out around Interlaken, and that's just over the hill from Rocky Flats. The same thing happens there. Very high winds whip across there. The water issue is an issue of serious concern. There was a soil scientist out there by the name of Iggy Latour, who a couple of years ago found plutonium moving very rapidly through the soils. Shortly after he made those discoveries, he was dismissed by the contractor, Kaiser Hill. So the more plutonium we leave in there, the more likely plutonium will be moved off-site, either through the wind or through water.
And in our last couple of minutes, we ought to talk a little bit about what people ought to do. We had a caller have someone slip me a message that suggesting that one thing we could do, right away, is to just start boycotting the companies involved with these projects, including boycotting their stock. But in addition to those kinds of actions, what do you suggest people do?
Well, I think that would be certainly a good idea, particularly with the weapons development companies. But I would suggest that people in this area, first of all, understand that there is a very real danger that still exists out at Rocky Flats in the form of the plutonium that's still there, the waste, and in terms of the contamination in the soil and the groundwater, and that they should be contacting elected officials, particularly local government officials, telling them that they want to see a credible cleanup there. I think that we also need to understand that an important part of the cleanup will be stabilizing the waste and the plutonium and making sure that it is stored in a credible manner, and not simply relying on hypothetical off-site solutions for these materials. But I do want to emphasize that the local governments are very important in this, and so for people in Boulder, you should be contacting the city council here and telling them to make sure the cleanup that occurs out there is a credible cleanup.
And that's the voice of Tom Marshall with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. We've been talking about nuclear issues here on Hemispheres this evening. I should remind listeners that one of our earlier guests, Byron Plumley from the American Friends Service Committee in Denver, will be delivering a talk tomorrow evening at 7:30 at the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, 1520 Euclid, on the subject of the Stockpile Stewardship Program and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Thank you very much for listening, and join us again next week.
Thank you, Richard.
Coming up next, we have Corriente.